Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Ethereum, dubious speculation. Every once in a while, I make a video, and almost immediately the market goes in the opposite direction. And it's very frustrating when that happens, but I am human and I will make mistakes. And so I hope you can at least acknowledge that I am trying to be upfront about that. I'm not trying to pretend like I'm right about everything. In reality, I know I actually get a lot of things wrong. So, one of the things that I mentioned recently is that I thought ETH would come home, which means going to the lower logarithmic regression trend line. And right after publishing that video, ETH went up about $500. Okay, so this does sometimes occur, and when it does occur, I do normally feel an overwhelming amount of pressure to sort of come out and admit I was wrong. And so I just want to get that out of the way and say, like, my views don't always pan out. With that said, these things have happened before. Sometimes my view still pans out, and then other times it just doesn't. And I just end up, the view is wrong, right? The last time I did a video where I came out and sort of apologized for the market immediately going in a direction that was different than the overall theory was back about 6 months ago when I made a video on ETH, also called Dubious Speculation. It was at 2950. And I basically was talking about how ETH Bitcoin was breaking down and that it would likely, we would likely see ETH drop a lot further back into the wedge, which would take it back to around 1900, which is where it did end up going eventually, but not before first going up to 3900, right? So right after making this video, when ETH was at 2950, it then skyrocketed to 3800 and then ultimately up to 3900. And I had to come out and apologize because ETH Bitcoin had this massive rally, right? I was calling for it to go to 0.03 to 0.04, and then it went back up to 0.05 to 0.06, right? And when that happened, it felt like everyone on Twitter was dunking on me and saying that the bottom was in for ETH Bitcoin, that I was wrong, and that Bitcoin dominance would never go to 60%. And then it turns out that the view was actually correct, right? I mean, if you actually go look at ETH Bitcoin during that move, we were actually talking about getting a May rally for ETH Bitcoin because that's exactly what happened in 2019, the year the Fed cut rates. A January, February, and May rally, just like this year, January, February, and May. Really interesting how it was basically the same exact thing. But when you're living through it on a daily basis, that pressure to sort of admit your wrongdoing is almost, insurmountable, right? It feels like the world's caving in around you and you have no choice but to come out and sort of stand before the court of public opinion. So that is one that eventually did pan out, right? I mean, it did eventually go to 0.03 to 0.04, and arguably it's getting pretty close to bottoming, and if it might have already bottomed, right? I mean, it's getting hard for me to, for me, ETH Bitcoin has gone low enough, right? I don't really think it needs to go any lower. I've already started to hedge, and that was one thing I mentioned in the last video where where I said Ethereum coming home, was that I've already started to hedge, and a lot of people don't understand. They're like, why? If you think ETH is going to drop below 2000 again, why would you buy it, right? Because I don't think about ETH on its USD pair. I think about it on its Bitcoin pair, and I think the low for ETH Bitcoin is between 0.03 to 0.04. I think this is the bottoming range for ETH Bitcoin. Predicting the USD valuation is a lot harder because that's going to be dependent on Bitcoin USD. So for me, I've already started to hedge. I've already started to actively bet against the view that I feel so much that I felt conviction on of it going home. So to some degree, I have myself to blame. But there's a lesson I've learned through the years. I'd rather be rich and wrong than poor and right? I'd rather hedge against my view and then make money if I'm wrong. And then if I am right, then at least, it was a hedge and it wasn't like a full-blown, moon position, right? Where you're betting the family farm, which a lot of people tend to do. So, which you really should never do, especially in crypto. But that's the thing, right? I feel like I have to hedge at this point, and I said so. I said the same thing in the last video on ETH. It makes sense because ETH Bitcoin is getting pretty close to a bottom if it hasn't already bottomed. Now, if you look at ETH Bitcoin, I've said if you get daily closes above the 50-day moving average, there's a good chance the bottom's in. It's gotten close, but it hasn't actually taken it out yet. It wicked above it over here, and it just wicked above it again. And the funny thing is these wicks occurred after the rate cut, right? You had a rate cut here, and then it wicked above it. And then you had a rate cut here, and then it wicked above it. If it can get daily closes above it, then the odds of the low being in go up substantially. I've already started making conversions, right? I don't need to time it perfectly so that if I'm wrong about ETH going home, I can still rest easy knowing that I have some ETH. But if ETH were to go home, the dilemma that I face at this point, and it's the reason why I hedge, is because ETH Bitcoin has already sort of gone to its own home of 0.03 to 0.04, the reality is it's likely not going to go that much lower. So in order for ETH USD to go home, there'd have to be a broader correction in the market. But the problem with that is for there to be a broader correction in the market, Bitcoin would have to basically fade the general seasonality, right? If you were to go look at year-to-date ROI of Bitcoin, in halving years, it normally goes up in Q4. And by normally, I mean it always has gone up in Q4. And we've talked about the cyclical view of Bitcoin a lot. It normally goes up in Q4 of the halving year. If you look at the ROI from the bottom, Bitcoin is right where it always is at this point in the cycle. The only thing from a cyclical point of view that would give some evidence to suggest that Bitcoin could drop and it not be sort of the end of the cycle is if you get peak to peak, you could see, and you compare it to 2 cycles ago, Bitcoin could drop 30-40% and still be ahead of where it was in 2016 in the 2016 cycle, right? So that would suggest that you could have another drop and it not be that big of a deal. The other thing, though, at this point is, Bitcoin, there's a lot of things going for it right now, right? The seasonality is strong. So in order for Bitcoin to sell off and to fade seasonality, you would have to get a broader correction in the stock market, right? Because if you don't get a broader correction in the stock market, then why would Bitcoin go down? And if Bitcoin doesn't go down, then ETH isn't going to go down, more than likely. Earlier this year, Bitcoin was going sideways and ETH was going down. But now, because ETH Bitcoin has gone to 0.03 to 0.04, if Bitcoin goes up, ETH's probably going to go with it. And if Bitcoin goes down, ETH's probably going to go with it. So in that case, it makes sense to then start to look at the S&P. Is there any reason for the S&P to drop? The reality is the best strategy for the S&P, no matter what, in my view, in my opinion, is to just DCA, low expense ratio index funds. That's what I do. I don't try to time the market with the S&P. I'll express opinions about it, but all I do is I blindly DCA no matter what, right? As long as the risk level is low enough, which it usually is, because I DCA it up to a pretty high risk level. So for me, to bet against, to sort of bet on Ethereum going home would mean to bet on a market-wide correction, which is something that's very difficult to bet on. Think about how many times you hear someone call for a crash and how many times it doesn't actually occur. And that's essentially what you would have to bet on at this point for Ethereum to actually go home in any short-term time frame that's reasonable as an investor. Okay, so are there any, is there any evidence of the S&P needing to cool off at some point soon? I mean, look, it's approaching 6,000. Maybe that will be some form of resistance, but the reality is when it hit 5,000, it just blew right through it like it wasn't even there. So it's not even necessary. It's not even necessary that 6,000 is resistance. One interesting thing that I found, which again, if you're looking hard enough, you'll find what you're looking for, right? You can always find a reason to worry. That's the reason why markets climb the wall of worry, is because people always find stuff to worry about. But if you look at the S&P divided by M2, you can actually see a strong similarity between, sort of here and 1996. This low here, by the way, in 2022 was also the same spot that the S&P bottomed out against M2 in December 2018. And you can see it was also topping at the same spot in February 2020 and December 2021 and August 2023, and then it ultimately went through. But you can see that the S&P divided by M2 actually got about a 20% correction after it hit this level right here, which is exactly where it is today, basically. I mean, I think if it went up to like a little bit higher, it's basically there right now, but that's where it could get, if it were to follow that cycle, that's where it would get that correction. What's interesting is that this pattern, we've seen this pattern before, sort of the lower high structure, lower high, lower low, sort of your bull flag, you break out, everyone gets excited, and then it goes down, right? That is what would have to happen. And you get your sort of your 20% drop, right? If the S&P were to drop 20%, I have no doubt that Ethereum would go home, because if the S&P is dropping, then Bitcoin's dropping, and if Bitcoin's dropping, then ETH is dropping. But there's no, and this pattern is something we've actually seen with Bitcoin before, right? I mean, you could even look back at 2020. That's not really the best example, because that was, a pandemic induced recession. So I'm not asking you to look at that and take it to the bank, because, how do you plan for something like that? But that's the only way at this point, right? Is if it gets this correction here. That's the only way that ETH goes home. And it's hard to call for that, right? It's hard to just say that has to happen, because there's a really good chance that it doesn't happen. There's a really good chance that Bitcoin just continues to follow the seasonal view, the cyclical view. So I've said, right, I think it makes sense to ride the seasonality until there's a compelling reason not to do so. The problem, I guess, is that when there is a compelling reason, the market price is in it almost immediately. But I think here's the thing, right? The reason why I think it does make sense to start hedging with ETH is because the Bitcoin valuation of it is so low. So if Bitcoin gets a larger correction, it doesn't necessarily mean that ETH has to go down a lot more than Bitcoin, okay? Any individual asset has the idiosyncratic risk and the market risk, right? The market risk is basically the broader market. If the broader market goes down, that asset likely goes down. The idiosyncratic risk is the risk of that individual asset, okay? It's the same thing with, like, if you were to look at a stock like Nvidia, which continues to do well, it continues to do well, but you have other stocks that at one point looked like they were following Nvidia, like Super Microcomputer, and then now it just got, it just dropped a lot, right? It just dropped, 83%, a casual 83%, right? That was the idiosyncratic risk of that stock. But that's why beating the S&P 500 is so hard, is because every stock has the idiosyncratic risk. But if you just buy the market, the S&P, all the idiosyncratic risks essentially cancel themselves out. So then you're just left with the market risk. That's why beating the S&P is nearly impossible, because when you're trading individual stocks, you're dealing with the idiosyncratic risk of each individual stock. The reason I'm bringing this up is because at this point, the idiosyncratic risk of ETH for me, I think, is relatively low. If it goes down from here, it has to be because there's a market-wide sell-off, not because there's something fundamentally wrong with ETH, or because it's overvalued against Bitcoin, because now I think it's actually at a fair value against Bitcoin. So that's the reason why in the last video I said it makes sense to hedge the view of ETH going home. And it still does. As convincing as we can make things be, the reason why the market has to sell off, it doesn't have to do it. It doesn't have to do anything, right? It could just continue to go up. And yes, there's always going to be something to worry about. For instance, the 3-month and the 10-year yield are likely about to uninvert. And it was actually the uninversion process of the 2-year and the 10-year that corresponded with this sell-off by ETH right here in August. And I've said if there is another sell-off, it would be in December, because this was April, August, and then December would be the last one, just like 2016, April, August, and December. But I could be wrong. And please understand, I'm not just saying that to sort of cover myself. I'm saying it because I truly do believe I could be wrong about this. My conviction on ETH Bitcoin is a lot higher than ETH USD. I have a conviction about ETH going home, because it just seems like when ETH Bitcoin breaks down, ETH USD drops 70%, and so far it only dropped 50. It just kind of, it leaves a little bit to be desired, but at the end of the day, in a year, it probably doesn't matter, I guess, is the issue, right? It doesn't really matter in a year. And if it doesn't matter in a year, why does it matter right now? So I think for me at this point, I think especially because Bitcoin dominance has gone to 60%, it's easier to start hedging these things, because I don't really feel that same conviction as I once did about ETH Bitcoin dropping. I think it's dropped enough. If it drops more, it drops more, but I don't think it necessarily has to. I guess QT continuing would be the biggest evidence for it, but we'll see. Um, so at this point, I think the appropriate strategy for me is to just continue hedging that view and to increasingly hedge that view as the year goes on. And if it goes home, then I would, significantly increase my position. If it doesn't go home, then I just keep slowly hedging it until it's apparent that it's not going to. Right. And then I just ride the position that I have that I've managed to accumulate from hedging, over from Bitcoin, and I just ride that and be happy with that, right? Be happy that ETH Bitcoin went to 0.03 to 0.04, and I was essentially able to double up my ETH just by sitting in Bitcoin for 2.5 years. What an easy strategy, right? Convert it to Bitcoin, wait till it gets devalued 60%, and then convert back. Pretty simple, right? It was an easy way to sort of just double up on my ETH just by sitting in Bitcoin during quantitative tightening. I don't want to watch the 0.03 to 0.04 range come and go. I want to make sure that I at least take advantage of it while it's here, because I think there's a good chance that next year it'll be higher than it is today, and it feels like the theory proved useful. 0.03 to 0.04, wait for it. Don't fall for the gurus telling you that it's going to bottom at 0.06 or 0.05 or 0.07. They were wrong. They just didn't know it. Just wait. And I don't say that in a way to sort of take a knock at them. I get things wrong too, all the time. And this could be one of them. This could be one of those things. And I maybe I mentioned this earlier, but it does feel like deja vu, because there was that rally by ETH Bitcoin, in May, and then I felt like I had to come out and apologize, and then, it did end up coming true. One of the reasons why I don't think I've ever actually shared this with you guys, but one of the reasons why I was really hoping for ETH USD to go home is because there's like a little, I think my video maybe froze. I really need to get a new laptop. I still record all these videos just from my MacBook Pro, uh, which is kind of funny. And I guess it's proof that you don't really need a fancy setup to make YouTube videos. So if that's the thing that's keeping you back, holding you back from doing this stuff, just know that you really don't need a fancy setup to get started. But there was this cool thing that I thought would have been nice to show you guys, if it actually went home, right? If ETH actually went home, there's a cool little trick that you can do that I thought would help identify a future top. And that was one of the reasons why I was so hopeful that it would happen. And it could still happen. But the trick is basically this, right? If you take the low for ETH and you connect the dots through QT, and you extend the trend line out, that trend line helps you identify the future top, right? So if you do the same thing over here, and you draw it through here, right? That August wick of the year that ETH Bitcoin broke down. That's the important thing. Draw the trend line through the August wick of the year that ETH Bitcoin breaks down, right? So 2016, a year that ETH Bitcoin broke down, draw the trend line through the August wick of that year, and that eventually marks the top a year later, a year and a half later, right? So then last cycle, draw the trend line through the August wick, and that eventually marks the top the following year, right? So that was why I was really hoping that it would come home, was because if it breaks down, right? If it breaks down, you have your trend line, right? You have the trend line through the August wick of the year that ETH Bitcoin broke down, right? You have your trend line right here through the August wick. If ETH USD were to break down, then you extend this trend line all the way out until whenever you think the peak is going to be, and that helps you identify the future peak, right? That was one of the, and I never really shared that with you guys. I was hoping to, to watch it break down and then be like, all right, guys, here we go. And it just keeps on not happening, right? It just keeps on not happening. The market keeps laughing in my face. And so rather than just sit around and wait for it to come true, which who knows if it ever will, I have to start hedging, right? I'd rather hedge and be ready for the other outcome than not be hedged and bet everything on one thing, on one outcome. I'd rather be hedged for two than to be all in on one, right? So that's kind of where I am, right? That's kind of where I am. So we'll see. And by the way, if it does break down, that's where ETH goes home, right? Once it sort of breaks through, and it's hard to draw the trend line. I mean, I was drawing it. If you actually connect it to the August wick, you can see that once it broke down here, it very quickly went home, right? Once it broke that trend line, ETH USD pretty quickly dropped 50 to 60%, right? So that trend line right now, if you just simply connect it to the August wick there, right? If you connect it to the August wick, it's hard to draw the trend line exactly, right? But I mean, you get the idea. Maybe you draw it through that one, maybe you draw it through this one. I don't know. If you draw it through that one, obviously it would cause for an area. It would yield sort of a higher future top. But if you draw it through that August wick or whatever, you take 50%, 50 to 60% down from that level. That takes ETH home. So that's what I was hoping for. I really thought that was the most likely outcome, and I still contend that it is a possibility. But the issue is that for it to occur, you have to have a wider market sell-off by Bitcoin and by the stock market. Now, it is true that Bitcoin dominance is at 60%, and I have said before there could be a correction after that. And the reason why, in my mind, it happened, the reason why I thought it happened last cycle was because once looser monetary policy comes in, what happens is that people that were just buying Bitcoin start to buy altcoins. Now that's fine, but that takes away some of the bid for Bitcoin. And if that bid gets taken away and then there's a correction, all of a sudden there's not the same number of buy orders ready to buy the dip because they're overbuying the altcoin dip. They're no longer buying the Bitcoin dip as much. They're buying the altcoin dip because now loose monetary policy has arrived. And that's why you sort of enter that window of weakness as rate cuts occur, because the blue chips no longer have all the buying power. Right now, the riskier stuff people start to bet on, and that's when the blue chips start to fall. And the blue chips fall, it takes down the higher risk stuff, but the higher risk stuff doesn't fall as much because it already fell a lot during QT, right? So that as QB comes back, that stuff could fall, but it doesn't fall nearly as much because it already got annihilated. Think about all these altcoins that are close to their lows rather than their 2021 highs. So, that's where I am. I don't really think there's a scenario where ETH goes home and Bitcoin's just screaming higher, you know? So in order for ETH to go home, Bitcoin would have to drop. It would have to have a drop back into that channel. And that's the only way. And, I don't want to sit up here in the halving year, in Q4 of the halving year, and just relentlessly call for that. I'd rather say, look, if the monetary policy view comes back and says it gets the last laugh, then so be it, right? I'll deal with that when it happens. I'll look for reasons to see if it's going to happen, but I'm not going to trade it, right? I'm not going to trade it. I sold some. I bought Bitcoin in late 2022, as I mentioned on here and on ITC Premium. I did sell some in this run up over here because the risk levels got relatively elevated, right? It made sense to sell some in those risk levels as Bitcoin, had that initial impulsive move up to 73K. And also when gold was breaking out and USDT dominance hit its long-term trend line, it made sense to de-risk a little bit because the likely outcome was that Bitcoin would go down for a little while, and it did. And that view panned out. But yeah, if Bitcoin just keeps screaming higher, then ETH isn't going home this year. The only way it goes home is if Bitcoin decides that it's not actually going to break out in a durable way, and then it actually comes back down here, and then it goes up. That's the only way. That's the only way. And that just doesn't really seem like a fun thing to sort of constantly preach on here. I'd rather just ride the seasonal view until proven otherwise. So that's where I am. Still Bitcoin heavy, like I have been for 3 years. Started hedging with some ETH. Have more ETH now than I've had in 3 years. The last time I bought ETH was probably in, I don't even know. I guess sometime in early 20 or maybe mid 2021 was probably the last time I actually bought any ETH. But now that ETH Bitcoin is at 0.03 to 0.04, I got to start hedging. And the thing is there's a chance where ETH Bitcoin, if Bitcoin does drop, it doesn't mean that ETH Bitcoin has to get annihilated, right? I mean, and that's what I'm saying, right? Now the risk on ETH is somewhat justified because it's probably near its bottom. Before it wasn't really justified because I was just going to bleed to Bitcoin anyways. So what was the point, right? So those are my views, guys. And I can sympathize with the idea of saying things like, oh well, this is my view, but I'm gonna hedge, so I cover myself both ways. I get that stuff. I know it's not cool to say that stuff, and that's why I'm saying it's not about being right or wrong. Set your ego aside and just trade the market, right? Trade the market. I would say set the ego aside if you can. I've tried to do that, getting better at it. That's the right strategy with trading. Ego aside, have your views, hedge against them when you start to think you might be wrong, and enjoy your life. And that's what I'm going to do. That's what I hope you do too. If ETH comes home in December, I will welcome it with open arms. And I will put a bow on the theory and be very happy going into 2025. If it doesn't come home, then so be it. I'm hedged. I'll continue to hedge between now and the end of the year, and we'll see what happens with it. But that's where I stand. And those are my views. So we'll see. We'll see what happens with ETH. We'll see if it actually comes home or not. Just know that I do get things wrong, and this could very well be one of those things. I was much more convinced of ETH Bitcoin going to 0.03 to 0.04 than ETH USD going home. As much as I want it to, it doesn't have to happen. It would be nice, if in December it happens and I can be like, finally it's over. But I know that it doesn't actually have to. So we'll see what happens, guys. If you feel like you're let down because, ETH is up $500, it's going to happen a lot more. So get used to it. I'm going to be wrong a lot. So anyways, if you guys like the content, subscribe, video thumbs up. Again, check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.